So this story is about a very famous Unitarian minister called Theodore Parker. And we heard about the social justice work that a social justice committee does. Well, he was one of our great social justice leaders, but he was back 150, 160 years ago. This is a story when he was a young boy. He was like 4 or 5 years old. And like many young boys, he was intrigued by animals. And he was walking through the countryside. He grew up in Massachusetts, and he was walking through the countryside, and he saw this turtle out in this pond, and the turtle was on this branch of a tree, just sunning itself, minding its own business, having a good time. But he was a curious young boy, and a lot of young boys kind of get intrigued by animals. So he got this stick, and he was thinking, oh, I could knock it off, I could poke it and knock it off. And he was about to do it, and he was reaching out to knock it off, and then something came over him and thought, that's not very fair. The turtle's minding its own business, enjoying the sun. I'm out here in the country enjoying the sun. I shouldn't do that. Why would I do that? So he went home, and he told his mother about this. He said, Mom, I had this really strange experience. I was going to knock and disturb this animal that was minding its own business, and then something came over me that said I shouldn't do that. But I don't know what it was. It was a really strong feeling. And the mother said, that's your conscience. That's your conscience coming up. And whatever your conscience tells you about something, disturbs you, and says, perhaps you should do something, you shouldn't do something, you have to honor that. If you always honor your conscience, then you'll be okay. So he learned that, and he became a Unitarian minister, and he became really one of the leaders in abolishing slavery, because he looked at how African Americans were getting treated so badly in the country. He thought his conscience told him that was wrong. He also recognized that women did not have the right to vote, so he became passionate about getting the right to vote for women. And even in his sermons, this was back 150 years ago, he referred to God as Father and Mother, which was quite revolutionary 150 years ago. So, I mean, he really kind of drove his conscience. If you look at our fifth principle is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process in our congregations and the world at large. And I think when we face this election we're coming up, you've probably heard there's a lot going on with the election coming up on Tuesday. And those who stay in the sanctuary is going to hear a lot more about it later, because we haven't had enough of the election yet. Because the conscience, we have to bring our conscience into the ballot box. We have to bring our conscience into our actions. We have to bring our conscience into how we treat one another and how we treat animals, because it's so easy to pick on things that are more vulnerable or weaker than us. And Cesar Chavez was a great union leader in California, and he said that societies will be judged more by how they treat the vulnerable and the weak, and not how they treat the powerful. I think we should need to remember that and bring that to the foremost of our conscience.
So, let justice roll like a mighty stream is an inspirational phrase, an inspiring song. And I have moments, and now it's feeling like one of them, where that is not only really comforting for me, but it also doesn't completely work, because I get the vision of the future. And I would love it if I could stand by and let the justice roll, but I need to help make it roll. And that's where I get stuck right now. It reminds me a bit of Theodore Parker, to come back. He seems to be popular this morning. He had this soaring statement about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I love that phrase. I've loved it for a long time. It's been inspiring and soothing to me in difficult moments. But right now, a few days away from this coming election, the thing that is echoing more in my mind is former President Barack Obama's coda to that statement, which was something along the lines of, that may be true, but you still have to do the bending. I love the image of justice rolling like a mighty stream, but weighing on my mind right now is this massive opposing image, given the change that sure looks like it's going to be coming in a few days. And that's the specter of this massive injustice building an impenetrable three gorges-like dam across what felt like that once promising stream. So what do I do about that? Losing when I care so much is really hard. It is a change forced upon me that I didn't want, and it can even scare me. And what do I do? Well, I can get mad, demonize the people who beat me, or I can get despondent and just walk away. Or worst of all, I can get cynical, and this is the particular purview of my Generation X approach, which is to still stay involved, but to simply sit on the sidelines and take pot shots. I don't want to be that person. But the higher the stakes, and they feel high for our democracy right now, and the worse it looks for what I care about, the stronger the pull I feel to just get mad or despondent or cynical. So how do I stay connected to myself, to what I love and what breaks my heart, as Reverend Brian so frequently reminds us? How do I stay open to people and the world with compassion and vulnerability and love? And how do I do all that while still trying to play my part on that important bending of the moral universe to justice? So a story. In this election cycle, I've been deeply involved in what has become a really gnarly ballot initiative fight in Menlo Park. I want to defeat Measure V. I believe it's an attempt to put in place the 21st century equivalent of housing redlining against people of color. I currently serve as chair of our city's planning commission, and as chair, I signed the letter that appears in the official ballot information opposing Measure V. Another planning commissioner signed the letter on the opposite page in favor of Measure V. I've written an op-ed in opposition in the local paper. He's written an op-ed in support. He's also been vocal on Nextdoor with comments that I find laced with misogyny and derision. At the same time, every 2 weeks, we spend hours together in planning commission meetings working through decisions on land use regarding everything from single-family homes to major developments. It is hard for me right now not to reflexively tune out or oppose everything he says. And yet, he's an architect. I'm not. He served on the commission for 14 years, while I've served for 4. And most importantly, in his comments over these years, it is both clear to me that he cares deeply about our community and that he often struggles, as I do, with how he should best demonstrate that commitment in his votes on the projects before us. I have absolutely learned from him, both on technical matters and from his perspectives. He has made my thinking sharper. Everybody has a story, and everyone's story can impact me in complex ways, even if I am inclined right now to write off his story as having only one theme, one that I believe is part of a horrible trend in our nation. But I've tried not to do that. Okay, so what's my point? Yes, it's that oversimplifying someone else's story is not fair, let alone compassionate. But to my utter amazement, avoiding that impulse also helped me to do my part in accomplishing something this past week that I think is important for our community and that I would have never thought possible. So while this ballot initiative fight has been going on, our Planning Commission has been considering whether and how to approve the largest, most expensive, most complicated development project in our city's history. It's the redevelopment of dozens of acres that are owned by Meta or Facebook, just adjacent to their current campus in Menlo Park in our community of Bellhaven, which is the community that's been the most discriminated against in our town in the last 100 years. This past Thursday, after 2 sessions and nearly 9 hours of presentation, comments, and deliberation on this project, I helped lead a recommendation that our city council approve it, but to do so with an increase in below market rate housing, with faster development of community amenities like a grocery store and air quality monitoring, with major increased investment in public transit connecting the community to the project, and a demand that the total vehicle trips to that project be reduced by enough to eliminate the building of a massive parking garage. That recommendation passed unanimously. And the only way I could help make that unanimous approval happen is because I had listened well enough to his values and his concerns. I could be careful not to tick him off with what I said, and I could appeal to his deep care for our community in my proposals. So I think my point is more than being open to someone else's story is the right thing to do morally, which I think it is. I also think it can make us more effective as we try to bend that moral arc of our community toward justice. I'm not being Pollyannish. I'm scared about what is happening nationally and what might be reinforced on Tuesday. But I have to keep trying, and I will take some solace in this small victory in Menlo Park this week as a way to keep me going.
I'd like to open with a prayer for the ballot box by Unitarian Universalist minister Luke Stevens-Royer, who wrote this prior to the presidential election in 2016. I walk in as on a pilgrimage. The altars are red, white, and blue. The ushers are the women who have been running these things, who have been running everything since before I was born. I am handed the ballot like a scroll, because the questions seem that important. Ancient and modern, of what my God and country ask of me. Who for commissioner, mayor, president? Who for District 8 and District 7, school board? Who will do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly? I make my mark with at least a shred of hope that something good will come from this. And regardless, I remember, the world won't be destroyed entirely by this. The world won't be saved entirely by this. Marking my vote is like kneeling in prayer, because neither will accomplish anything right away. But the purpose of both is to remind me of my deepest hope for the world that I'm trying to help create. So I rise from my prayer, turn in on my ballot, and remember the who is me and us and we the people. And again, I set to the task that is mine, justice, mercy, humble service in my small corner of the world. Those are the words of Reverend Luke Stevens-Royer. That's a very noble view of the election. But like Chris, I am frightened about the upcoming election. And I think of the words of Reverend Edward Hale, who was a Unitarian minister who was the chaplain of the Senate in 1903. And he said, "Do you pray for the senators, Dr. Hale?" And he says, "No, I look at the senators and pray for the country." I look at the country and I pray for the country. I'm pessimistic about what will happen in Tuesday's elections. Things are going to change, and the theme for this month is change. And of course, the theme for last month was courage. No coincidence there. You need courage to change. And I don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday, but I do fear the worst. And I fear the worst because I think there will be an increase in the suffering of too many people in our country. And some of you know I've talked about the idea of reverse Unitarianism, where I want to reduce the greatest suffering for the greatest number. That is my focus as a minister, to reduce the greatest amount of suffering for the greatest number of people. And some people think that's pessimistic. I don't. Because I think suffering ending suffering can be the path to joy, can be the path to justice, and can be the path to a greater love in our world and our country. And of course, as Chris mentioned about Theodore Parker, the moral act of the universe bends towards justice. I'm struggling right now to see the universe as moral and to see the arc bending towards justice. I'm not hopeful that my preferred candidates will win this coming election, but I've kind of got used to that throughout my life. It wasn't until 2008 I actually voted for a candidate that won. But I think what's greater worry for me is that I think our whole democratic institution is under threat. There used to be, you could argue people had different tax policy, healthcare policy, education policy. Now the whole democracy seems to be under threat. And for a long time, I thought the number one issue was environmental justice. And I no longer believe that. I'm highly committed. I've started environmental organizations in my time, interfaith environmental organizations. I still believe it's important, but I think there's something that's fundamentally more important. And I don't think we all realize that what the election is about, because I think the election about now is, can we have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial democracy? Because we've never had that. There were steps taken in 1964 and 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act to move towards that. But throughout the democratic history of this country and every country, there have been people that have been excluded. Women have been excluded. African Americans have been excluded. Indigenous people have been excluded. And I think we are looking, and this is what the battle of this election about. And it's not just this election, it's a series of elections that are going on right now throughout the world that are about, can we have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial democracy? And that is the bigger issue, and that's what I feel is fundamentally more important even than the environment, which I believe is vitally important. The American-German political scientist Jasker Munk has got this wonderful book called The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. I thoroughly recommend reading that book or finding interviews of him. And he says this: we are embarking on a historically unique experiment, that of turning a mono-ethnic, monocultural democracy into multi-ethnic one. And I think that's what's going on. You see the pushback, and mainly from the Republican Party, in this white Christian nationalism against any form of diversity, against critical race theory, against anything that's trying to bring diversity of opinions into the public debate. And it's not just happening here. It certainly happened with President Trump in 2016 to 2020, but it's happening in France with Marine Le Pen. It's happening in India with Narendra Modi, with his Hindu nationalism. It's happening in Hungary with Viktor Orban. And there's this backlash against ethnic and religious diversity. And I think that backlash could end democracy, because we don't know how to have a multi-ethnic democracy. And I think we need to realize that that's the framework for which we are entering this election. And yes, I'm pessimistic about this election, but I think it's a series of elections. We're not going to get there in one election, 2 elections, 3 elections. This is going to be lifelong work that will probably last well beyond I'm on this planet. And I suspect that's true for many of us. And the trouble is that we're fighting populism and fear, which are powerful, powerful emotions. You see that with the extreme right and the Christian nationalists throughout the world. You see that with Hungary. You see that with the Hindu nationalism of Modi in India, where they're really trying to thwart diversity, even willing to overthrow democracy to make that happen. And democracy actually makes managing diversity harder, which may come as a shock. It came as a shock to me till I read about it. Because democracy is always about the majority. So how does that mean for those historically marginalized? What does that mean for minorities? If democracy is about the majority, the most votes win. And I'm not going to get into the electoral college, and that doesn't really work in the United States. That's another sermon. But generally, democracy is about majorities. And what does that mean for historically marginalized? Does that just mean the tyranny of the majority? And we have a constitution in the United States that's supposed to defend the rights of those minorities, those historically marginalized, but it's not served women well, it's not served African Americans well, it's not served immigrants well. And so we need to bring that constitution to the benefit of all people. As Cesar Chavez said, as I mentioned, in the Time for All Ages, societies and governments will be judged by how we treat the weakest and most vulnerable in a society, not by the rich and powerful. But the Spirit, as a religious community and as a person of faith, the Spirit brings me a power to bring the best out of me and to help me through hard times. And I liked what Chris asked earlier. I was like, how will I be changed by this election? Because change is inevitable. Growth is optional. So how do you choose to respond to the change that will happen in this election? Parker Palmer, the Quaker sociologist, says, if American democracy fails, the ultimate cause will not be a foreign invasion or the power of big money or the greed and dishonesty of some elected officials, or even a military coup, or the internal communist, socialist, fascist takeover that keeps some Americans awake at night. Will happen because we, you and I, become so fearful of each other, of our differences, and of the future, that we unravel the civic community on which democracy depends, losing our power to resist all that threatens it and calls it back to its highest form. Those are the words of sociologist and Quaker Parker Palmer. So when I think about change, I think what I'm looking to change as a result of this election, it's not my mind, but changing my heart. How can I become more empathetic like Chris demonstrated with this person who he had strong opposition to, but was able to connect and be open to his ideas and consequently be more open to changing him. One of my go-to stories, and I mentioned this during one of my candidate sermons here at UUFRC, is from Rachel Naomi Remen's My Grandfather's Blessing. It's called The Buddha's Heart. And whenever I'm struggling, I go back to this story. And the story is about this young man called David who's struggling with juvenile diabetes. And as a teenager, he threw himself against that disease with all the fury of someone who felt wronged. And he said, why does life treat me this way? Why do I deserve this? And David was not modifying his diet. He was not taking his medicine. He was not doing anything that may have helped him cope with that disease. But then one time, during one of his fits of anger, this image of the Buddha came. And David wasn't religious, but he was from California, so he knew what the Buddha looked like. It was a young Buddha. And David felt a calm and a serenity came over him as he looked at this picture of the Buddha. Then all of a sudden, a knife came from over his shoulder and entered the Buddha's heart. And David was shocked, and he got that same fury that he had when he got his diagnosis of juvenile diabetes. He said, why is life like this? Why is it unfair? But then slowly and imperceptibly, he saw that the Buddha was growing. And the Buddha's heart was growing. But the knife that was embedded in the heart stayed the same. And the heart expanded and expanded until the knife became but a speck on the heart. And he realized that was Buddha's response to the knife. The Buddha grew in response to hardship. The Buddha grew in response to wrongdoing. He grew his capacity for love. He grew for his capacity for compassion. He grew for his capacity to change, his capacity for courage. So I look at this election, and that's what I look for. I look for a change of my heart, a growth in my heart. Can I grow to have more love rather than hate, to grow, have more hope rather than fear? Can I grow to have more faith rather than doubt? Can I grow to have more joy than sadness? Because I think what the country needs is more people to have a change of heart than a change of mind. And I think for those of us, like myself, as a white, straight white man, who come with a lot of privilege, because I know as a result of this election, more people are going to be suffering. But I'm most likely not one of them. So the call is to me to expand, to take the high road, to grow in my capacity for love, for joy, for faith, for hope. And look at this long-term struggle that we are in to create this multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial democracy. And keeping an eye on this. This is a long-term project well beyond this coming election, well beyond the election in 2024 and 2026 and 2028. This is a lifelong goal, and that is what I want to be my legacy, what I want the legacy of UUFRC, of our Unitarian Universalist movement to be, that we work to be that multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-religious democracy that could be the first time in human history. It's a labor of faith, it's a labor of love, it's a labor of hope. But isn't that a beautiful and powerful and noble goal?